una soñadora, ella os contará su vida, una mujer que ha hecho un gran trabajo de investigación científica, es decir, que tiene una carrera académica, una carrera de bióloga y de primatóloga, pero al mismo tiempo es una mujer que ha trabajado en condiciones muy difíciles, en las selvas de Borneo, en los años 70 empezó, si no en los 60, no me acuerdo bien, cuando el mundo era otro distinto. Y os lo puedo garantizar, lo puedo asegurar porque yo estaba allí, no en Borneo, estaba aquí, e incluso esto en los años 60 no tenía nada que ver en términos de comunicaciones, de todo, de transporte con lo que es ahora. Es decir, sus condiciones de trabajo en Borneo eran dificilísimas, se necesitaba pues mucha determinación, mucho talento también, mucho coraje, en fin, todas las cualidades que ella reúne. De forma que es verdaderamente un ejemplo a imitar, un ejemplo a seguir. No sé cuántos de nosotros seríamos, seguramente ninguno, seríamos capaces de hacer lo que ella hizo. De manera que en una sociedad en la que se recurre a la épica para referirnos al deporte, a un futbolista que ha jugado un partido de 90 minutos, o a un jugador de baloncesto o a un tenista, y se cuenta en términos heroicos, imaginaos lo que es pasar años y años en una selva en Borneo, totalmente incomunicado, y entre gente que no habla tu idioma, y culturas que te cuesta trabajo entender. Eso es heroísmo, eso es épica, y no un partido de tenis. Sin desmerecer el valor que tiene el deporte. Pero nuestros héroes no solamente son los deportistas, sino que tenemos otros ejemplos igual de admirables y igual de atractivos. Porque esta es una vida bien empleada. Eso es lo que quería deciros. Solo cuando uno cumple años se da cuenta de que solo tiene una vida. Una. Y que tiene que decidir qué hace con ella. ¿Y en qué la emplea? A vuestra edad no se piensa, pero después te das cuenta de que solo tienes una vida y la tienes que utilizar bien. Y esta es una vida bien empleada. Entonces, solo quería transmitiros que estamos en presencia de una persona excepcional, única, mundialmente famosa, mundialmente reconocida, mundialmente conocida y además comprometida con la causa de la conservación, con la causa de la naturaleza, con la causa del clima, por lo tanto con la causa de la humanidad y del planeta. No solamente una investigadora en condiciones muy difíciles, no solamente un científico, sino además una persona comprometida con la causa del planeta, con la causa de todos. Todo eso es lo que tiene ella. Eso, solo quería transmitiros que algún día, a partir de hoy, cuando queráis, podréis decir que yo conocí a Biruté Galdikas, ¿no? Eso que se dice muchas veces cuando hemos tenido como uno de los momentos de nuestra vida estelares, ¿no? Pues recordaréis el día en el que conocisteis a Biruté Galdikas. Si tenéis alguna duda, solo tenéis que coger el móvil, no ahora, ahora cogéis el móvil, luego y tecleéis Biruté Galdikas. Así de simple. Y veréis quién es, la persona que vamos a tener la oportunidad de conocer. Termino con una cosa que me parece importante a vuestras edades. Hay un autor, uno de los escritores y creadores de la conciencia ecológica y de la conservación de la naturaleza, que se llama un americano Thoreau. Por cierto, vosotros sois de educación bilingüe, con lo cual podríais leerlo. Thoreau, que escribió un libro muy famoso que se llama Walden, que podéis trabajar. Bueno, el libro Walden dice algo que yo creo que se aplica a Biruté. El libro Walden, dice el autor, me fui a vivir a los bosques. I'm talking about Thoreau. Walden, you remember. The first sentence is, me fui a vivir a los bosques porque quería vivir, utiliza una palabra que me encanta, quería vivir deliberadamente. No fuera a ser que al final de los días, de mis días, descubriera que no había vivido, ¿no? Bueno, Biruté, desde luego, puede reflexionar sobre su vida y sentirse satisfecha porque ella ha vivido. y ha vivido para sí misma y para todos los demás. De manera que os dejo con ella y con Esther, que va a ser el enlace entre vuestras preguntas, ¿no?
Eso es. Yo estoy encantada de saludaros y, por supuesto, como ha dicho, de estar, sobre todo, estar sentada aquí al lado de la doctora Galdikas. Yo pertenezco a la Asociación Española de Comunicación Científica. Estamos aquí en un congreso de comunicadores y periodistas y pues a eso venimos, a contar cosas. Me han dicho que todos pertenecéis a coles que son, o a institutos que son bilingües. Entonces quería saber, antes de empezar, si podemos ir hablando en inglés. Ella solamente habla inglés. Si hay algún problema, si nos perdemos, si queréis, o sea, la idea es que preguntéis vosotros y vosotras, pero si no queréis preguntar en inglés, bueno, intentad hacerlo, pero yo lo traduzco y nada, vamos a empezar. Voy a hacer una pequeña introducción de ella y de su vida y comenzamos, ¿vale? Lo voy a hacer en inglés y así ya nos vamos metiendo en el papel. ¿Bien? Ok. It wasn't that good. Well, we are here today with a scientist, a conservationist, an educator for over decades. Dr. Birute Galdikas has studied and worked closely with orangutans of Indonesian Borneo in their natural habitat, and is today the world's foremost authority on the orangutan. She was born after the end of the World War II, while her parents were en route to Canada from their homeland in Lithuania. Galdikas grew up and went to school in Toronto. Okay, ¿estamos bien todos con el inglés? Bien, bien, ole. Okay, I'll carry on. As a graduate student, she first met the Kenyan anthropologist, Dr. Louis Leakey, and spoke with him about her desire to study orangutans. Although Dr. Leakey seemed disinterested at first, she's a very persuasive person and persuaded him with her passion. After 3 years, Dr. Leakey found the funding for Galdikas orangutan studies, as he has previously done with Jane Goodall or Dian Fossey. Do you know her? Have you ever heard about all of the three of them? Well, you should. Then, as Arzuaga said before, you should check it on your phone later. But the main thing and the most important thing is that she dedicated her life to the study of the orangutans, to help them, to try to make a better world for them and obviously for us. So we will be very happy to hear your questions. What would you ask to a person who dedicated her life to the orangutans? You don't have any doubts? Well, I do, Dr. Galdikas. I want to know, at what age did you realize that you wanted to study the orangutans?
Okay, so first of all, I'm just going to make a comment.
Yeah,
and I
sure.
want to thank the person who introduced me for his lovely introduction. I didn't understand a word, but I know it was lovely.
Yeah, it was lovely.
Yeah,
definitely.
So thank you. So to answer your question, I was an adolescent.
Yeah?
And the reason that I grew attracted to orangutans is just from looking at my first photograph of one. Mm-hmm. And I remember that photograph as clearly as if it were day, as clearly as if it were right in front of me. And that photograph was of a sub-adult male orangutan. I didn't know it at the time, but he was Sumatran, a sub-adult male Sumatran orangutan, and he was looking straight into the camera, and there was something so human in his gaze and the way he looked at you that I was captivated. And if you had chopped off the bottom part of his jaw, like here, you would think he was human.
Wow.
And there was something about it, about him. And I actually have the photograph even now.
Oh, nice. Just give me 1 second, sorry. ¿Estáis entendiendo bien? ¿Lo vais? ¿Sí? Bien, perfecto.
Yeah, you understood. Good.
Good. Yeah, they're getting everything, yeah.
Well, you're English students, right? Students of the English language, right? Yeah, okay.
And you were impacted by that photograph, and why did you see this photograph? Where was it?
It was just in a book. I think it was maybe that photograph has been reproduced. It's a very old photograph, so it must be over. It's probably close to 60 years old. That photograph, because I saw it when I was a young teenager. And it was just in a book about nature.
Nice.
Book of nature.
Do any of you want to be a scientist or a biologist? And oh, there's some over there. Good. Nice.
But I was always interested in science. I was always interested in nature. Even as a child, I wondered about things. I was very curious. I wondered about, where people came from, what it meant to look up in the stars and what was up there in the stars, what our history was. Although at the time I didn't know it was an evolutionary history. So I was always very, very curious. And I hope that curiosity has stayed with me. And I think that's what makes a good scientist, is somebody who is very, very curious about the world. And remember what Einstein said.
What? You tell us.
He said something to the effect that imagination is more important than knowledge in the pursuit of science. Yeah, so I've always had that imagination and that curiosity, and I've tried to accumulate the knowledge.
So as he said, if you are curious, if you want to know where do we come from, where the stars come from and everything else, you might be a really good scientist.
Yeah,
so keep asking. And what did you study to become a scientist?
I just went to normal high school in Toronto, and then my parents moved to Winnipeg, which is in central Canada, and then I went to university in Canada. I went to the University of British Columbia for a year, and I was a zoology major. And then
what? Sorry, geology?
Which is like biology.
Ah, biology.
Yeah.
Okay.
Zoology, study of
zoology,
animals,
okay.
mainly. And then I went to UCLA, the University of California in Los Angeles, because my parents were Canadian, but they wanted to be American. So it took them a long time as Canadians to immigrate to the United States. So of course I went with them. And when I went to UCLA, the world opened up. And the reason the world opened up is because UCLA is a huge university. It's always in the top 20 in the world. And there were so many subjects. There were so many majors. It wasn't quite like UBC, but it was very, very straightforward and almost limited. So at UBC, I was taking courses in things like medieval history.
Okay.
But mainly I took, courses in chemistry, physics, and zoology. But then I went to UCLA, and you could take courses in gypsy folklore, which I took. And so my world widened, and I took a lot of courses, but I majored in psychology and zoology. minored in zoology. And then I became a graduate student. But while I'm taking these courses, all these other courses, I took a course in the history of art, courses that were not, maybe they were available at UBC, but nobody steered you, nobody told you. And
so you would recommend that even though you have it really clear that you want to be a scientist, still study some parts of other disciplines?
Absolutely, because it gives you a wider perspective, and you never know when a bit of knowledge that you thought might be irrelevant becomes relevant, or it gives you an idea. And so when I graduated, I got my degree, I decided to become an anthropologist, actually an archaeologist. And so I went to graduate school as an anthropologist, and for a year I had to take all the anthropology courses that I had not taken as an undergraduate, because I'd majored in psychology and zoology. And so as a graduate student, I was taking courses in Mesoamerican archaeology, Indo-European studies, wonderful, wonderful things.
Okay, so the idea is for you to be the ones asking. So if at any time any of you wants to ask, please raise your hand and I will give you the... Okay? Do you have any questions so far?
Okay, well, let's start with the front row.
Okay, if they don't ask, we will ask them.
No, we'll ask. Okay, would you ask a question, please? Please ask a question. Any question. You could ask me how old I am. You could ask me what I think of Spain. You could ask me what comic books I read as a kid. Ask me anything. Or what my favorite orangutan is. There isn't one, but you can ask me.
Why were you interested in orangutans and not in other animals?
Why was I interested in orangutans and not other animals? I was always interested in other animals. And I was also very, very interested in human history, where humans came from. And when I looked at that picture of the orangutan, it was very clear that this was a creature who had to be related to humans. And of course, they are. And so one of the reasons that I went to study orangutans is because of the gaze. I felt something in my soul when I looked at that picture. And also, orangutans had not been studied. So I was the first person not to study orangutans. There were other people who studied orangutans in the wild, but I was the first person to ever study them long term in the wild. So I have been working with them for 48 years, and I'm still there. And I have to thank the Indonesian government, even though terrible things have happened to me, and of course even more terrible to orangutans, I'm still there. I'm still allowed to be there. So,
you are still going to Indonesia?
I live about 6 months in Indonesia. And one of the things that people don't realize is the world is complicated. And there are things like taxes, so there's a reason I stay 6 months in Indonesia. Could stay longer. My husband is Indonesian, but it's also helpful to, I teach in North America at North American University, so I have to spend one semester a year there. But Indonesia is basically my home.
Okay, more questions.
Okay, next
very
one.
Well. That was very good one. Yeah, next one.
What was the first thing you discovered?
What's the best way to what? I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
What is the main thing you discovered about orangutans?
The main thing I discovered about orangutans is that they are just like us, even though they are very, very different. Even though their adaptations are different, even though they are solitary or semi-solitary, just totally different from humans. We humans are social par excellence. But even though they are very different in their adaptations, they're actually just the same. in their emotions, in the way they express their emotions, but they are different. But the difference is, it comes from their adaptations. Then the other thing that I learned, and I only learned this very recently, is that I knew that orangutans are not our closest living relatives, right? But yet, everybody who meets an orangutan close up and interacts with them in a free setting. I'm talking about a free setting. I'm not talking about captivity, but I'm talking when you're in the forest and there's a habituated orangutan for whatever reason, and he or she interacts with you, you immediately feel like you're interacting with somebody that you know. There's a familiarity there. So that I knew, but I also knew that orangutans were not our closest living relatives. Our closest living relatives are chimpanzees, and they are so close to us, it kind of makes you scared. It's actually kind of frightening, because chimpanzees are extremely social. They commit the equivalent of genocide. They make tools. They use tools. They're just so much like us. Like I said, it's almost frightening. Orangutans are not like that. They're a little bit different because they live alone. So their adaptation is different. But what I learned very recently, in the last maybe 4 or 5 years, is that even though orangutans are not that closely related to us, we cannot receive a blood transfusion from an orangutan, but we can receive a blood transfusion from a chimpanzee once blood groups are matched.
Wow, really?
Yeah. Because chimpanzees share 99.5% of their genetic material with us. So they are our siblings. They are our brothers and sisters. Orangutans are more like our cousins. But, getting back to my original point, 4 or 5 years ago, I talked with somebody who knew genetics. And guess what? Orangutans, this explains their familiarity to us, are more closely related to our ancestors than we are. So they are not just closely, cousins, they're also almost ancestors. And when we interact with them, I think that's where the familiarity comes from. It's like we're interacting with our own ancestors. And probably orangutan adaptation 10 to 13 million years ago, which was a time when our ancestors separated from the ancestors of orangutans, orangutan adaptation was quite different. Maybe they were more social. I don't know. But all I can tell you is that when you look at a skull of some creature, like, from the Siwalik Hills of India, like Shivapithecus, you look at his or her skull, and you know that that is an orangutan. So that tells you orangutans have not changed over the millennia. Shivapithecus, 13 million years ago. I mean, and I'm not I took archaeology briefly, but I'm not an archaeologist. But even I can tell. I look at that skull, Shivapithecus. It's an orangutan. It could only be an orangutan. So it's an orangutan ancestor probably just after the split with the humans. Yeah. So that's why we feel so familiar with orangutans. And that's what I've learned. I mean, I can tell you little details of what I've learned, but that's not as important as the fact that they're so similar to us. That's the main lesson that I, as a person, have learned. Next question.
Have you always been supportive with your investigation?
I'm sorry.
Have you always been supported with your investigation?
Have I always been supported?
Yeah, that everyone around you supported you to.
No, it's not that simple. No. I mean, I'm not going to talk about it, but I have been kidnapped and beaten. I have had terrorist kinds of campaigns against me. It's not easy being somebody who is an advocate for an animal that has forests, that lives in a forest, forests that are very valuable when they're cut down. So, there was a period in my time when talk about lack of support. But in the end, in the very end, the Indonesian government, for whatever reason, and that's another discussion, did support me. I mean, I had two Indonesian police officers, basically live with me for 3 years. I mean, when I went to follow a wild orangutan, one of them went with me into the swamps. And that was because the Indonesian government did not want anything to happen to me. And, funding, I was very fortunate because Louis Leakey was my mentor. And Louis Leakey just had a foundation established for him in the United States. A group of Americans, scientists and lay people got together and established the Leakey Foundation. Leakey Foundation, you can look it up, it's prosperous. And part of it is because he did something that scientists didn't do 60 years ago, and that was he communicated science. He held press conferences. He talked about what he had found. So he worked with the public. He had an impact on the public. So anyway, so I was very fortunate because I was mentored by Louis Leakey. So Louis Leakey found me the first funding. And so during the first 10 years of my work, the people that funded me were people that were had been associated with Louis Leakey or the Leakey Foundation, even though he died about a year after I went into the field. So I had that support, but then that support ended, and it's a struggle. So the first year that I was in the field, and that was 1971 to 1972, we lived on $2,000 American dollars.
In 1 year?
1 year, $2,000. And you can look at pictures of me, and people say, "Oh, you look so good, you look so glamorous." And this tells you about something about Western civilization, because you're looking at a picture of a woman who is starving. And so I got very thin.
Yeah.
$2,000. And then, we started getting more and more money, and then the Leakey Foundation stopped, and then we had to find our own money. And then finally, I decided, and people did encourage me. This is where people did encourage me. And they said, establish your own foundation. And this is what I and some friends did. And that is the Orangutan Foundation International, OFI, which I hope you will all support in one way or another. And then it never got easier. And then we had a film made called Born to be Wild, and suddenly people became more aware of the work. And then the internet started up, and you actually have people in the world, I don't know if you have them in Spain, but you have them in the United States, where they actually troll the internet looking for charities to support. They read your website. And so I've had several people come to us, bigger donors, and they said that of all the groups they have read about, they said we are the ones that are actually doing things. And that's why they support us out of thin air, because they're convinced by what we do. Now, I don't just study orangutans now.
Because you have your own foundation.
Which is Orangutan Foundation International.
Orangutan Foundation International. You can look for that on the internet and see all the work.
Yeah, OFI. So it's been a struggle. I mean, it hasn't come easy. People think that, because I'm well known, I'm one of the trimates, Jane Goodall and Dian Fossey, who are world famous, that it's easy. It's not easy. It's never easy being a scientist. For one reason. But
it's worth it.
Well, you have to believe in what you are doing. You have to like what you are doing. If you don't like it, don't do it. You have to follow your passion. So even when I was dressed in tatters, suffering from malnutrition, my hair went bright orange, bright yellow. And it wasn't just because and it's naturally just blonde, just sort of light brown hair, medium brown. But, and it was from lack of protein. Part of it was just this bleaching of the sun, but also lack of protein. So this is life in the field. But the political life and the economic life is actually harder than the life in the field. Thank you. That's a good question.
And what's the hardest part of your job?
I'm sorry?
The hardest part of your job?
The conservation part of my job?
The hardest.
Oh, the hardest part of my job is to balance.
Sorry?
Is to balance
To
it.
balance.
And what I mean is that I am against palm oil. But I have to be very careful how I say it. That's, you know, you have to balance what you say, you have to balance what you do, and especially if you are working in a country like Indonesia, which I clearly love, but, you know, you have to deal with all the issues there. You have to deal with the local people who are not, we get along very well with the local people. My husband, I've been married to my current husband for 40 years, and my children are, two of my children are Indonesian, but it's the balance, it's to keep the balance. So, you know, you don't become critical, you don't make a statement that later you have to turn around and retract. And so maintaining that balance is very difficult.
Okay. I have seen one question over there and another over there. Okay, please.
Living in the wild with orangutans, have you had any adverse information with them?
Could you repeat the question?
While
Please.
living in the wild with the orangutans,
Living in the wild with the orangutans?
while living in the wild with orangutans, have you had any dangerous confrontation with them?
I didn't get the last part. Well, we're living with the
Have you ever had a dangerous confrontation with an orangutan?
Well, it could have been dangerous. It could have been dangerous. But the thing about wild orangutans is you can't run. You can't run. I mean, you have to stand up to them.
Are they faster than us?
What?
Are they faster than us? They kind of outrun us?
Are they runners? Well, on the forest floor where you have vines and saplings, they are faster. On bare ground, like here, a human is faster. But in the forest, you know, there's things in your way, and you know, you're grabbing things, and they're on the ground. So when they are on, you know, on their 4 feet or whatever, or they're about this high. So they run through the vegetation, especially if they're males, like a tank. You know, they just pull the sapling, you know, out of the way, and you're struggling. So, yeah, you can't run. You have to confront them. Then you also have to acquiesce to them. So, for instance, there were males in the early days. They were adult males that were in the trees, and they were so upset and so irritated, so annoyed, so angered by my presence. Or I also sometimes followed with my former husband, you know, our presence, that I would say, okay, he's too angry, let's just leave him and not try to habituate him. Okay. So yes, there have been dangerous situations, but they could have been dangerous.
Bueno, buenos días a todos. La vas a tener que traducir.
Okay, no,
Que no es
no hay
inglés,
problema.
¿vale?
I will translate.
Bueno, yo simplemente voy a hacer una pequeña reflexión de medio minuto para que entendáis lo que está ocurriendo aquí, ¿vale? En el planeta hay personas que miran solo por sí mismas, miran por su familia, miran por su entorno y personas que miran por todos. Esta persona que tenéis aquí delante es de las 10 personas más importantes que hay ahora mismo en el planeta. Está luchando día a día porque el planeta esté mejor para cuando vosotros tengáis ese futuro que buscáis. No perdáis la oportunidad de preguntarle cosas importantes. No perdáis esa oportunidad, no vengáis aquí simplemente a pasar el rato. Preguntar, pero preguntar cosas sinceras, de verdad. Esta oportunidad ojalá lo hubiese tenido mi generación y de verdad hubiese escuchado. el planeta no sería como es ahora. Sería mucho mejor. De verdad, pensar en algo interesante. Tiene millones de anécdotas. Ha tenido que luchar día a día por sus sueños. Vosotros tendréis vuestros sueños. ¿Queréis el secreto para llegar a vuestro sueño? Ahí lo tenéis. Preguntar cosas interesantes. Gracias.
Go on to questions?
Yeah, definitely.
So we're
Okay.
going to continue with this now.
This guy, he's
you have a question. Okay.
Okay, so the first time you went for studying the orangutans in the wild, how did you interact with them? Like, how did you get close to them?
Is the question how I interacted the first time with the orangutans? Is that the question?
Yeah.
Oh, well, the first few times, is you had to find them. They're in the tops of the trees. They live in a different universe. And then when you found them, you followed them. And that's basically what you did. And much of the time they would be irritated, they would be annoyed because they'd never had any human being follow them. They'd seen them because local people would go by. There were trails and they were wild rubber tappers, so they weren't interested in the orangutans or the animals. They were looking for the wild rubber. So you just followed them. And if you continued following them day in, day out, then they became used to your presence. And there were several times where I saw that they finally understood it. It would be like an adult male orangutan would be sitting up in the top of the tree, and he would look at you. And when they look at you, they're thinking about you most of the time. And so he's looking at us, he's thinking about us. I was with my then husband, and suddenly he just came straight down the tree. Then he looked at us one more time, and there was a little bit of doubt in my mind what his purpose was. And then he started digging for termites in the ground, the forest floor. So he obviously, in that moment, had made up his mind that we were not dangerous. And then it was much easier to follow him. And I think there's actually some film footage from 1973 or 1973 where we are following him. It was 1974 that a film crew came from National Geographic. Yeah, so you had to follow them. And it wasn't easy. There was one female that it took us 15 years to habituate her. And the problem was that adult orangutans live alone. So just because you habituate one doesn't mean that you've habituated anybody else. Chimpanzees or gorillas, you habituate a group. So you habituate one in the group and the others follow because they're, social groups. Orangutans is not like that. I mean, even, 48 years later, I still encounter even females that are unhabituated because they're not in the core of where my assistants and I normally look for orangutans, search for orangutans. And in the olden days, the males, virtually every single male that came through was a stranger, so you had to habituate him, but then he left. And you had to start with a new male. Yeah, so it's not easy. And this is why not many people have done it. If it was easy, a lot of people would do it. Look at all the people who study baboons. And why can you study baboons? Well, in places like Amboseli National Park, you get in a jeep, car, and you drive, and you follow them around. And sometimes, in the early days, the person who got out of the car and actually walked behind them, a person like Shirley Strum, was considered a pioneer. She actually got out of the car. Well, the closest car to where we are is 50 kilometers away, so.
That's hard.
Yeah, you're not going to follow them in a car. Okay.
Any questions over there, or we carry on? Okay.
Okay, let's ask this question. This person.
Yeah.
Why did you decide to live with the orangutans instead of studying?
I'm sorry.
Why did you decide to live with the orangutans instead of study from a distance?
Why did I choose to live with orangutans rather than studying?
Instead of studying them from the distance.
Oh, because you really had no choice. Basically, if you want to study wild orangutans, you have to go down on the forest floor and follow them and watch them, because they're not going to come down to you. So you're basically, until you habituate them, you have to follow them from a distance. Thank you.
Okay, next.
What's the most difficult part of studying orangutans?
What is the most difficult part of studying orangutans? Well, it's kind of like what I said previously to another question. It's not the field work. The field work is hard, but that's like physical and mental. You can control it. You can control yourself. You know, you can get up at 3 o'clock in the morning to walk an hour and a half to nest. You know, where the orangutan is going to get up half an hour later. You know, you can live on 3 or 4 hours sleep. You know, you can live on water all day. So that you can control. It's almost like being an athlete. But the part you can't control is the social and the political and the economic aspect of it. And that is the hardest thing of following and working with animals. And even in Canada, you know, it's a very civilized place. You know, wonderful health system, all that stuff. Very advanced. Even there, people who study bears get into political trouble and are evicted, you know, from national parks or from protected areas. And that's because they had trouble, you know, with the socio-economic aspects of it. So those are the real difficult parts. And that's one of the reasons often, you know, we wonder, why did this study in Pakistan, you know, end after a year? Well, it's because the researcher was thrown out. But is the researcher going to walk the world and say, I was thrown out? No, they don't talk about it. They just publish their one-year study. You know, and so it's walking the tightrope, the socio-economic political tightrope. But it's so hard. And then I believe we talked about the conservation crisis, right, in Spanish, which I didn't quite understand. But you see, that's the part that is very difficult to negotiate. You have to be very careful. And so one of the things that I have learned in Indonesia, and you know, I wasn't born Indonesian, but I am Indonesian, and is that you have to say things without actually saying them. You know, you get good at it. And the reason is that you don't want to spark somebody who's really, you know, somebody in the government or somebody among the elites, or, you know, who tries to go against you just because you're there. So, you know, so that's what people have to do. And some of them are very good at it. Some of them are not.
Thank you.
I just want to say one thing.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Just one thing. So my ancestry is Lithuanian, right? My parents came from Lithuania after the Second World War to Canada. My parents became Canadian. But when I grew up, I lived in a bicultural world. And that bicultural world is, you know, the Lithuanian community, the Baltic community in Toronto, and then the Canadian, you know, the WASP, the Anglo community. And of course, the Anglo community was the major community. But because of this experience of living in two cultures, and then I did archaeology. I did archaeology in the former Yugoslavia. And so I experienced in the former, when I was doing archaeology in the former Yugoslavia, I experienced the American and the British archaeologists.
Oh, something happened with your mic.
Yeah, went to.
Oh, that's all right.
Basically went to war against the Yugoslav archaeologists. So I watched these two cultures, and these two cultures, it came to a point where the PhDs and the professors were actually physically attacking each other. The Yugoslavs against the Americans and the British. And it made me very conscious of the fact that
it's not working properly.
To be aware of culture. And even as I'm in Spain just a few days, it's been very interesting to me because I see little points which are slightly different, from American culture. They're not necessarily, some of them are actually better, but it's just different, little tiny differences. So when I went to Indonesia, I had the Yugoslav experience in my head. I mean, can you imagine this? People with PhDs attacking other people because they differed in their interpretation of archaeological theory, and and the Americans had a van, and the Yugoslavs didn't. So the Yugoslavs had a van and the Americans didn't. So the Yugoslav archaeologists actually hijacked the van, beat up the Yugoslav driver, and these are PhDs, faculty members, and took over the van, right? Can you imagine this? Maybe you can. So when I went to Indonesia, I had all these experiences, and that made me realize that I was in Indonesia and I could not give up my own integrity, but I also had to acknowledge that we were Indonesia and the Indonesians had the right of way. So just to explain a little bit about where I come from and what my attitudes are.
Okay, next. Please.
Did you ever thought about giving up in your investigation?
I'm sorry?
That if you ever thought about giving up in your investigation and why?
You mean, have I ever thought about giving up doing my orangutan work?
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, no, because the orangutans, I don't want to sound arrogant, but the orangutans really do need as many people as possible to proselytize for them, to work for them, to help them. And so...
Why? Which are their threats?
So their threats are numerous, and the main threat is, of course, the annihilation of the tropical rainforest is their home. And the palm oil plantations, the timber estates, which for pulp and paper, the illegal logging, the legal and illegal mining, development, just general, road building, all this is causing orangutan habitat to disappear and to fragment. So orangutans are pushed into smaller and smaller pieces of forest, and then strange things happen. And what are the strange things? Well, one of the things that has come out is for the first time we have seen orangutans kill other orangutans. And it's like people have been looking at them. I've been looking at them for almost 50 years. Now you're getting these strange little hiccups. And it's because they're being pushed. They're starving. They're being killed. They're being murdered. They're being tortured. I mean, people have thrown benzene on orangutans and palm oil plantations and burned them alive. So they're under threat. Those are the threats. And the threats are very, very real. But the threats, I have been saying for 40 years, if you save orangutans in the wild, you save humans. Because they are facing the same problems related to climate change that we are. And if you want to mitigate climate change, one of the things that you do is plant trees. It's been, there are articles in Science that say, plant 1 trillion trees, or plant all these trees. That tree planting, rewilding of nature is one solution to global climate change. So we have been planting trees I mean, we first started planting trees in the 1980s. We didn't plant them all that much, because I was doing an orangutan study. But for the last 2 years, we have been planting like crazy. We have 8 people in our tree planting and rewilding program. And rewilding is different from planting trees. Rewilding is planting trees so the forest comes back in its natural state. So in the last 2 years, we have planted, and forgive me if I'm a little bit off, but I think what the head of our herbarium told me, 380,000 trees. We have 8 people. But what we do is we hire, when it actually comes to putting the seedlings or the saplings into the ground, we hire on a contract basis local people, both men and women, to come in and help us plant. So that's what we're doing.
So by helping orangutans, we're helping us as well.
Yeah, I've been saying that. I mean, we all breathe the same oxygen.
Yeah, definitely.
We all drink the same water. Thank you.
So, what is your opinion on Trump or Bolsonaro politics about global warming?
Could you?
Sorry, can you repeat it?
What is your opinion on Trump or Bolsonaro's politics about global warming?
Oh, Trump and Bolsonaro's politics.
Sorry?
What is your opinion about Trump and Bolsonaro's politics about global warming?
Well, like I said, you need a balance, you need to walk a tightrope. So I'm not going to say anything about President Trump. I'm going to keep quiet about President Trump. And I don't have to keep quiet. You can make your own opinions. Just reading the news, and like even this morning, my colleague and I were reading the New York Times, and President Trump just pulled out troops from part of Kurdistan. And then he got criticism from his own party. And, it's like back and forth, back and forth. So, you can read the New York Times or whatever the Spanish equivalent is and make up your own opinion. And what do I believe about climate change? Well, let me put it this way. When I first went to Borneo 48 years ago, everywhere there were leeches. And leeches need moisture. I mean, I've written about it. I'd look in my underwear and this bloated leech would fall out. There'd be a leech on my neck, and they don't jump, they climb.
Do you know what a leech is? Okay.
Blood-sucking worm, basically. Does everybody know what a leech is? Yeah. Anyway, so there were leeches everywhere. I mean, it was like I'd half an hour in the forest and I'd pull up my jeans or my pants, whatever, and there would be trails of blood, where a leech had fallen off. Or I'd find them all still sticking to me. And it was really, it wasn't horrible, it was just, you're not used to it, and it's kind of, and leeches don't transmit many diseases. Mm-hmm. They're not major disease transmitters, say like mosquitoes or flies. And then we had a drought. It was 1972. And for a while, there weren't as many leeches. And then we had another drought. We had fires. In that 72 drought, we did have fires, but they were minor. And then we had another drought, another drought. Huge fires, all associated with El Nino. And one day, about 20 years ago, one of my local assistants, who was not, and again, I'm just stating a fact, he wasn't the most worldly or brilliant of assistants. He said to me, "You noticed that the leeches are gone?" And actually, I had noticed, but I thought it was just my own prejudice or my own observation. But when he said that, I realized, yeah, the leeches were gone. And then the other thing that started happening is my Dayak assistants. Most of my assistants are Dayaks. They are the Aboriginal people of Borneo. They are the ones that were made famous in the 19th century because they were headhunters. They used to be quite, that are militaristic. You know, they're strong people, powerful people. And one of my Dayak assistants, and they're people of the forest, and one of my Dayak assistants said to me, have you noticed that it's gotten warmer? It was about 20 years ago. And I said, yes, it does seem warmer, but it was like he verified my observation that it was getting warmer. And now, it's downright hot. I mean, I was in the hospital very recently, and it was from dehydration and heat exhaustion. Because if you walk outside the forest, it is so hot. We are 2 degrees south of the equator. So in my own personal experience, and the personal experience of people in Indonesia, you know, who don't know about climate warming, they don't know about climate change. That's not of interest to them. They just know what is happening now where they live. They say it's getting warmer. Things are changing, and that is global climate change. And it's happening. I mean, you may deny the fact that humans have caused it, but then you look at the changes, and the changes begin with something called the Zeus effect. And the Zeus effect begins as the carbon going up the atmosphere, and the Zeus effect begins with industrialization. I mean, you can look back into when, you know, humans industrialized, and that industrialization process started in the UK, in Great Britain. And you can track it, and then it spread to the world. Because something is happening. And then if you look at all the forests that have been cut down, you look at what's happening to the oceans, how polluted they're getting, the pollution in the air, you cannot deny that it has not been caused by humans. So that's my opinion of climate change.
Totally. We have time for one more question, or maybe 2. So, okay, 2.
What changes are watching in the environment? What changes are watching in the environment and the orangutans caused by the global warming?
What? Sorry, could you please stand up and repeat your question? Is easier.
Vale. ¿Qué cambios se está viendo sobre el cambio climático en el medio en el que trabajas y en los orangutanes, en las sociedades?
How the climate change affects the orangutans?
Well, the same as it affects us. I mean, you know, the forests are burning, and there's smoke in the air. I mean, their energy is lowered. They don't spend as much time looking for food. But most important of all, the phenology of the forest changes. The phenology are the fruiting, flowering processes that go on in the forest. And so what happens is when you have these droughts, which are exacerbated by the El Nino phenomena, which is exacerbated by, you know, global climate change, the orangutan fruit seasons are disrupted. The trees aren't fruiting. So, you know, we're beginning to have phenomena in other places, fortunately not where we are, but other places where orangutans are starving to death because the fruits are not coming into season. So orangutans are forced to eat bark. They're forced to eat just young leaves. And when they're forced to eat just bark, nutritional value is much lower than fruit and flowers. So they start suffering from malnutrition. Once you start suffering from malnutrition, it's much easier for an infectious disease or a parasite to get you. So the changes are occurring. They're occurring right now. And I read a report by some distinguished scientists that said that even if not one single tree is cut down, that in the next 10, 20 years, if global climate change continues, which is mainly global warming, which doesn't mean it gets warmer everywhere, that orangutan populations in the wild will drop by 1/3. That's if we do nothing. But of course, they're busy cutting down trees. They're busy making palm oil plantations even now. So it's affecting us all. And like I said, 40 years ago, I said, if you save orangutans, we save humankind because of these overall issues.
Okay.
I worry.
Oh. Okay. Yeah, definitely. We'll go for it. Yeah. Stand up. It's easier for you.
Okay, thank you. I worried about the orangutans, no, and I think, what can I do to help the cows?
What kind of human?
What kind?
What kind of human?
That was good. He's worried about the orangutans, so what can he do to help the cause?
Okay, so I thought...
Venga, que tenemos poco tiempo, vamos a aprovechar.
So I thought what you said was, you asked about what kind of human can you become? It's a good question, I like that question. Well, how can you help orangutans? Well, the first thing you can do is say no to palm oil. You know, they say there's sustainable palm oil. No, it's a fabrication. Be careful about what you eat. Eat less meat. Because much of the methane and the carbon dioxide that's generated is based on large areas of land having cows, particularly cows. So eat less meat, say no to palm oil, and just be careful in your... Oh, another thing, recycle paper. And why do I say recycle paper? Because the forests of the orangutans are being cut down to establish pulp and paper plantations. And the countries in the north cannot keep up in terms of price and production with pulp and paper compared to the tropics, because trees grow much faster in the tropics. So, you know, in Canada, where you basically, you know, there's less diversity, you do have massive tree plantations. But they can't keep up with, you know, the cheaper tropical forests, cheaper tropical industrial forests that have been planted in orangutan habitat in Indonesia. So recycle paper. I mean, when you recycle paper, indirectly you really help orangutans. So those are things that everybody can do. But the most important thing, I think, is I have been very encouraged by the young woman, what is her name, Greta? The Swedish woman, the Swedish girl?
Yeah, Greta Thunberg,
yeah,
I think.
She's speaking truth. I mean, she's speaking the truth. She's saying the truth that nobody else has said. And she's saying it to political leaders. And what she's saying is the emperor has no clothes. And the emperor is Western and global society and economies. We have to change our economies, that's all. And in order to change our economies, we may have to change our political systems. And that depends in democracies, like there are in the Western world, mean you have to change the politicians. And you have to vote. You have to vote differently. You have to vote politicians. You have to listen to economists who are saying, a few economists who are saying, our economic system is rotten.
Sorry, thank you.
It's just very difficult.
How difficult was for you to change your environment? I mean, to suddenly start living in the middle of the wild. How did you feel?
How did I change my environment? And how did I feel about what?
How difficult it was for you to, when you moved from Canada or UCLA to Indonesia, how did you feel too, that big change? How was it for you?
It's uncomfortable. I mean, even you know, I come back to the United States or Canada or to Spain, you can turn on the faucet and you can drink the water. You know, you can turn on the whatever, and you can take a hot bath. You can go to a grocery store and buy food. And it was totally different in Indonesia almost 50 years ago. And it's still different. It's you know, Indonesia is industrializing, becoming Western much more frequently. It's actually getting more schizophrenic because part of it is becoming more Western, part of it is becoming more Middle Eastern. So you get this. But still, in terms of creature comforts, in terms of society, you know, it's much more comfortable. But it was very difficult. Like I said, you know, my former husband and I were starving. We weren't able to get enough food because it was a 50-mile journey to the town, and we had to go in our speedboat and our longboat, and our longboat would, you know, and would break down, so we had to paddle, you know, 50 kilometers down to the, you know, it was hard, and it's still hard. I mean, I go back to North America, and it's like, wow, I can flush the toilet. In Indonesia, I have to take buckets where we live anyways. So it's hard. But you know what? It's like what I said before. The physical comfort you can deal with. You can be like an athlete because it's you. But it's the outside that is much more difficult. Yeah.
I have a question too.
Okay. Okay, this one will be the last question, okay? You want to ask? You want to ask?
One more.
Se lo iba a pedir yo, sí.
So, when you were studying the orangutans, what was your everyday life and the routine you kept?
Well, I kept this routine for the first 20 years, and that is when I lived at Camp Leakey full time, and the research was like the main focus. I mean, we still focused on the research, but it's different because we focus on other things. So the routine was that we would get up very early in the morning, and in the first 10 years or so, I spent most of my time with my former husband in the forest. We had a small open camp, and he would cook breakfast, make the coffee, and then I would wash the dishes. That was our agreement. Whoever cooked didn't have to wash the dishes. So I was mainly, he was a cook, I was wash the dishes, and then we would go out and we would walk and walk and walk, and one time I walked 20 days from dawn to dusk basically, and we're looking for wild orangutans. Like I said, 20 days. It took me once 20 days of walking, basically shortly after dusk, and we got up very, very early. We got up at dawn. And then we'd walk. He and I would split. So Rod would go one way, I'd go another way, and we would be looking for wild orangutans. Now, at the end of the day, we sometimes would come together. We would tie ribbons around trees to show the other one where we had been. So at the end of the 20th day, he and I were walking, and it was getting dark, and we finally found an orangutan. And then the thing is, the next morning, we would get up really early before dawn, and we would go back to the nest where he or she had made a nest and follow him or her the rest of the day. And I actually did this once for 60 days. 60 days I followed a wild orangutan. Another time I followed a wild orangutan for 30 days. So, you know, you got into the pattern, you got into the rhythm. Yeah. And that's what we did more or less for the first 20 years, except that my former husband went back to Canada, and I married a local man. Then he and I would do it. But I'm still married to him 40 years later. So that was our first routine. Now it's much more different, in some ways difficult. You know, we get official visitors. We have a wild-born ex-captive rehabilitation program where we just went under 300. We have 300 orangutans that we have to take care of. We have a medical facility. You know, we have the tree planting. We have an education program in the schools, the local schools, and now in Jakarta. And the last month, in September, we had a small workshop that was put on by somebody else, but with us. We had Australian vets come, a group of Australian vets come. They did an operation on Malayan sun bear, a corrected congenital defect, on an orangutan who had been badly beaten, and her arm dangled kind of almost uselessly. So I had all those things to deal with. But the main thing I had to deal with were the fires. I mean, massive fires like you wouldn't believe. And the smoke in the air. And I mentioned I was in the hospital for heat exhaustion and dehydration. And part of it probably was smoke inhalation as well. I mean, the smoke gets so thick that in the morning you can put your hand in front of your face and not see it. So we were dealing with the fires. So that's what the last month has been like. And when you think, well, conference, workshop, it's not that easy. I had to arrange for Dayak dancers and singers, to come to the end of the conference. I mean, that took phone calls and, payments. I mean, everything is much more difficult there than it is here or in North America. So I don't have a typical day anymore. Oh, I also had to fly to Jakarta for a meeting. So I flew for a few days in Jakarta, then flew back. And the planes were delayed because of the smoke, because of the fires. Yeah, so, typical day. Now it varies. And then, of course, I teach. I go back to a North American university and I teach. So I live a more typical North American life then. Yeah.
Thank you very much.